Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think, Alhamdulillah, we have it live now. I was just struggling because I spent the entire work trying to figure out this the OBS thing and how it works and how I'm able to, show visuals on live when I stream live. And so I must apologize to all of you for the very long delay in waiting. For those of you who are still with us and haven't left us, may Allah bless you for your patience and for your attendance. Now, alhamdulillah, we begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Last week I think we had a very good start to our series on kind of a more in-depth analysis of the Crusades. It's important for us to, of course, know about this, and as we mentioned last week, it's quite remarkable that there is always a really great interest that people have in the Crusades, and then what you might call the counter crusade, or what I call the anti-Frankish jihad, and how that developed over the centuries, and predominantly in the 12th century, between the first and then the third crusades. Now, just as a quick reminder for those of you who were with us last week, or who were not here with us last week, as a reminder for them and for all of us, what we kind of covered last week is a genesis of the Crusades, is the origin. We looked at the Iberian Crusades and the relevance of Al-Andalus, and so of course Muslims arrived in Al-Andalus in 711, and they remained in Al-Andalus for centuries, but their peak was really in the 9th and the 10th and the 11th centuries. But then there came, of course, between by the 13th centuries, where they were beginning to lose territory, and this was really precipitated by the emergence of the Muluk al-Tawa'if, which were party kingdoms. So you had independent autonomous entities, major states like Seville, Cordoba, Asija, and Malaga, and others who became independent. And so before that, there was the illustrious rule of great men like Abdurrahman III and even Al-Hakam II after him. There was a great fight back against the Christians of the north by Ibn Abi Amr al-Mansur. And they, by the way, had grown in strength. As we covered last week, we looked at the Battle of Covadonga and the way that the Visigothic nobility traveled north from the south of Spain and even the mid parts of Spain, and they kind of took refuge in the mountains of Galicia and Asturias. And they refused to embrace Islam, refused to pay the jizya, and they fought back against the Muslims. And they had one small victory in the Battle of Covadonga. It was led by a king, Pelagius, of the mountains of Asturia. And it really, therefore, thereafter, it inspired or revived the sense of spirit. Now, simultaneous with that, in fact, that time in the 11th century was the emergence of the crusade, and I say that with some caution, because the word crusade is a much later formulation, a word itself. What we're speaking of is the idea of the Militia Christi, which was the fight for Christ, or the Christ wars. What we were trying to understand was the struggle between the sacerdotium and the regnum. And the sacerdotium was this idea of the fight being entirely on sacred grounds, with sacred justification, and the regnum being the one done for secular purposes by the rulers, by the kingdom. And so the big struggle is one that emerged between the Emperor of Germany, Henry II, and Pope Gregory VII. And this was a big struggle, because what was happening is that from the around the 1034, I think 1054 it was, when you had this schism emerged between the Orthodox Church and then the Roman Catholic Church, and a lot of this depended on, or was built upon, the idea of who is power invested in. Is the Pope the ultimate universal power, whose power supersedes that of the temporal rulers of the world, or do the temporal rulers also have a say? And this schism led to greater problems between them. The idea was the investiture controversy, and so this was really about, would emperors ever be allowed to depose of bishops or appoint bishops? And simony, are clerics allowed to take payment for like marriage services and these kind of things? And so you had popes like Pope Gregory VII, and others as well with him, Alexander II, and then of course much later Urban II, who is our main topic of discussion because he announced the crusade, who became part of this papal reform movement, about taking power back for the papacy. And so in the 1030s, 1070s, and 80s, you had major events like the in Nomine Domini. And in Nomine Domini was this declaration from the papacy that it is never allowed for for an emperor to depose of a bishop or of a pope. Later on, you had even others where the only one who could depose of an emperor would in fact be the Pope himself. And this was really a struggle that took place. And so people had to take sides. In Urban II's context, he allied himself, was almost like a student of Pope Gregory VII. He even went to prison, for him because he supported his policies against the German emperor. And then, as we discussed, at the in the class last week, this really became quite toxic, and more power was invested, in the papacy in this time. Why was all of this relevant? Is because the crusade, the idea of the Militare Christi, or the Peregrini Militare Christi. Crusaders, in fact, were called Peregrini Militare Christi. They were pilgrim knights of Christ. They all needed justification. And so where you would expect perhaps before that a temporal ruler would call for a war, a holy war, or a war against a foreign enemy. In this case, of course, it was the Pope. And interestingly enough, in the First Crusade, there was no kings who went on the crusade. And Urban II, we're going to go, inshallah, through his letters today, looking at what were the justifications, what was the motivation, what was the rationale behind calling for a military war against the Muslims of Jerusalem. We spoke last week about the idea of the indulgence, and the indulgence is very key. It's going to come out again now when we discuss the letters, and that was really about the idea that the Catholics, they believed there was no longer sufficient, in the kind of in a person seeking of forgiveness, that he would go through absolution. Absolution was through confessing to a priest. It was not sufficient enough only to confess to a priest to have your sins forgiven. What was required is what's called a penitentia. A penitentia was a suffering. People had to go through a punishment in order to have their sins forgiven. That was one idea. The other idea was this great sense of enthusiasm about the belief in purgatory, that between heaven and hell there is a zone where Christians have to cross to have their sins forgiven as a punishment. But the idea of the indulgence meant that the Pope had the ability to provide full remission of sins, for those who he wanted. I mean, in particular cases, in this case, of course, the crusade, and that meant that they had no longer to worry about the penitentia, because that was the penitentia, the exertion, the traveling all the way to Jerusalem, 3,000 kilometers, about 1,600 something miles, preparing for the journey. That's like 3 years a night's wage, to provide the chainmail, the armor, the horses, the provisions for the journey and back. If they wanted to come back, from their journey to Jerusalem, that's a cost. Leaving wives, leaving children, leaving family, leaving estate, leaving your money, your job, everything. That's the real penitentia. That's the punishment. That's what you need to do to have your sins all entirely forgiven. And also you're going to pass purgatory as well. So that's an added bonus. That's the idea of the indulgence. Now, it's not, we can't say that Urban II was the first one to come up with the idea, because even before him, Henry II, he had indulgence. who else? John the Second. I think John the Second had no. Alexander the Second had indulgences. John the Second had indulgences, right? But what was key, and this is very essential for us today, is to understand that the distinction between kind of a militia secularis and a militia Christi was not altogether clear, right? That's a very key point, and you're going to see it today in the letter of one of the reports of the speeches of Urban II. And what that meant was that was it clear the military Christi, so that the fight, the war for Christ, and the war for a secular temporal ruler. And I'll tell you why it wasn't very clear, is because even though you had indulgences in the past with these said popes, John the Second and Alexander the Second, sometimes what they would do, as I think 1034, what Henry II did is that he fought against the Hungarians. Okay, now he's fighting against a foreign government, foreign entity, foreign power, emperor, and his people. That's a secular war. That's not a religious war. But the way he framed the narrative of the war was that he is fulfilling the peace of God movement. We might have discussed that slightly last time, the peace of God movement, and that was this idea that there has to be a reform, that people have to stop violence against one another. They have to stop violence against the church, the clergy, the bishops, the abbots, but also against themselves. You don't fight and kill each other, and to have more of a spiritual life. And that was it was very popular in the 10th and 11th centuries, and it came across again then in the 12th century. In this case, the end of the 11th century, because of the motivation of the Crusade. But the point was that Henry II, in his fight against the Hungarians, proclaimed that I'm doing it for the sake of the peace of God movement, and so therefore it has the religious backing to it. And what made it even clearer was that when he at the end, when he was victorious, he brought in the Pope Benedict to bring in the flags of St. Peter, right? Just to emphasize this was done not for secular temporal reasons, but it was done for the sake of Christ. And so that's an example of the way that the Militia Christi and the Militia Secularis was kind of how would you say it, was contorted for sure, but it was merged together in a way that compromised the whole essence of Militia Christi. And so what Urban II was really emphasized to do was that in this expedition there's going to be no sense of involvement in the temporal rulers. This is a struggle of the church. And so the indulgence really made that clear, for the Christians. And what was the struggle for? Well, a few things, as we discussed last time. There's Alexius Comnenus. He was the ruler of the Byzantine Empire. And he was strong. I mean, he ruled territories like, the Antioch, the north of Syria, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece was under his control, right? But the power was compromised by the rise of the Seljuk power. And so if you remember in 1074, when Alp Arslan defeated the Byzantines in the Battle of Manzikert, it was a devastating blow to them. The power thereafter was growing in the Muslim world of the Seljuk Empire, was growing in power. The power bases of Malik Shah and Nizam al-Mulk, this was all increasing in this time. And so the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus I, he felt very threatened, therefore he sends an envoy to Urban II asking for assistance. Well, now that was important because that's going to come across again in Urban's letter, because he's going to call, the Christian to go and defend and help the Orthodox, even though there was a schism. They're still called our brethren, right? But I believe, and historians believe anyway, that it wasn't only done for the purpose of mending this kind of a rift between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. it wasn't only that, it was to show the supremacy of the Catholic Church, isn't it? Because it's the Catholic Church who is going to help the Orthodox Church, and it's the Catholic Church who is pronouncing and calling for a crusade. It's the Catholic Church who is going all the way to rescue Jerusalem from the Muslims, and it was therefore designed to show the supremacy of the Catholic Church over the Byzantine Church. And so it had to be done. It had to be done right. But there was too much at stake for Urban II to get this wrong, right? And so there was a lot of very careful or sophisticated planning on how this would happen. And so in the month of March, by the way, in 1095, Urban II was in the north of Italy, in a place called Piacenza. In Piacenza, he was holding another council, and so not like in Clermont in France, the council in Piacenza, in north of Italy, was about like spiritual issues, about Cluniac monasticism. We discussed the Cluniac monasticism last time. The Cluniac monasticism was kind of there was many monastic orders like the Carthusians and the Benedictines and the Franciscans and the Gilbertines, and the Cluniacs were one of them. But in fact, the Cluniacs were a part of the Benedictine order, but he in trying to promote this Cluniac monasticism and spiritual reforms in the monastic order was what he spent his time doing. But he also alerted the people of Piacenza in that council that the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus needs help because he's being attacked. I mean, the Seljuk power is growing, right? And there's a threat that they're going to lose their empire to the Muslims. And then later that year, in November, was the time where he holds this grand council in the town or in the city of Clermont, right? And that's really where we need to be. And so what had happened? Well, Urban II, he had, called for this council, and it wasn't any ordinary council. It was, it went on for 2 weeks, and he invited very important people. He invited 13 archbishops, 80 abbots and bishops, and 80 cardinals and bishops and 90 abbots, to this grand council in Clermont. And that's a lot of very important clergy, right? If you imagine 13 archbishops, the archbishop is a second person under the Pope, and then you have 80 cardinals and bishops and 90 abbots, right? And so many others also who were there in the Council of Clermont. But just like the Council of Piacenza in March that year, he began, almost 2 weeks were taken up just by speaking about papal reforms, spiritual reforms, peace of God movement, be kind to one another, and so on and so forth. And then on the penultimate day, he made the declaration for the crusade, right? What we now know as the crusade, or the real, in his eyes, real Militiae Christi, the fight for Christ. And so today, inshallah, we're going to go through one of the accounts of his. There are 5 surviving reports of his speech. Now it's interesting because they actually differ quite significantly with one another, and so we don't know the fullness of how true each one is exactly to the word. The one we're going to go through today is by a man called Fulcher of Chartres, and he was from Chartres in France. He was an eyewitness, and he also authored a very, very important text of the First Crusade called the Gesta Francorum. And so we're going to go through his speech today and look at the kind of sentiments, the reasons, the explanations that Urban II is providing for the necessity to travel to Jerusalem, to capture Jerusalem from the Muslims. Remember last time we spoke about why that was even significant, about why that city was important for the Christians, and it's all about the Holy Sepulchre, which was the most sacred destination for the Christians, a place where they believed that Jesus was buried, for 3 days, 3 nights before he was resurrected in the Christian narrative. Of course, Muslims, we don't believe that, but that's what Christians believe, and it's sacred for other reasons too. We spoke about Helena, the mother of Constantine, having this vision tradition about that's where the tomb was, that's where the spear was, that's where the true cross is. And now, of course, it's venerated because it has the different chapels of Mary of Magdalene and Saint Longinus, the one they believe the Roman soldier who pierced Jesus with the lance. That's what Christians believe, and other things also. I think she also has a chapel for herself there, Saint Helena, also. And so therefore, I mean, the church itself, which was built over the temple of Jupiter, that was previously a pagan, destination, is the most sacred site for Christians in the world, and that's the whole reason. In fact, in the Crusades, it was called the Mater Ecclesiae, which was the mother church. And so the mother church was the church of the Holy Sepulchre. Anyway, that was reasons for that. You might also remember the incident of 1009 when the Fatimid Khalif al-Hakam bi Amr Allah destroyed a part of the Holy Sepulchre. That was provided as motivation for the Christians to go and rescue that place from the Muslims, because they were hearing all of these very negative stories from Christian pilgrims who were traveling, from Europe to Jerusalem. Very terrible stories about the way that, the church has been destroyed. But even that, you see, is not very convincing, because that's 1009. We're now in 1095, and so many decades have passed, and there had been no reports of abuse of Christians, for decades. But he's going to use that, because that's going to play on Christian in their minds, that this is something that we have to rescue. Anyway, that's what happened. Now you might notice that in front, or on top of me, here, right here, you can see a map. And Alhamdulillah, I'm so happy. I hope this is working properly, because I really tried hard to figure this OBS thing all out, so I can use images, and you can see. And by the way, it wasn't just that, because people were asking. They said that last week was really good, but we needed to see visuals to make sense of stuff. And so inshallah, I hope inshallah it will be beneficial for you. Anyway, we're not doing the map as yet. We're looking at the speech. And so I'm gonna play around now with my OBS, and let's try and do this. And so if you look now at the speech, I'm gonna highlight this so you can kind of follow where we're reading. And I apologize for the small text, but I will read inshallah with you. So as you can see, this is adapted from the chronicler Fulcher of Charts, and so from his text called the Gesta Francorum, and he was one of those who in fact went to Jerusalem. So let's see what he has to say. Now, if you read with me, you're welcome to read yourself as well. But he begins by saying, sorry, one second. He begins by saying, most beloved brethren, urged by necessity, I, Urban, by the permission of God, chief bishop and prelate over the whole world, have come into these parts as an ambassador with a divine admonition to you. Admonition, like as a warning for you, the servants of God. Right, so I hope to find you as faithful and as zealous in the service of God as I had supposed you to be. Right, so very kind of, praising them and kind of comforting words. But if there is in you any deformity or crookedness contrary to God's law, with divine help I will do my best to remove it. For God has put you as stewards over his family to minister to it. Happy indeed that you be, if he finds you faithful in your stewardship. You are called shepherds, to see that you do not act as hirelings, but be true shepherds, with your crooks always in your hands. Do not go to sleep, but guard on all sides the flock committed to you. For if through your carelessness or negligence a wolf carries away one of your sheep, you will surely lose the reward laid up for you with God. And after you have been bitterly scourged with remorse for your faults, you will be fiercely overwhelmed in hell, the abode of death. For according to the gospel, you are the salt of the earth. But if you fall short in your duty, how, it may be asked, can it be salted? Oh, how great the need of salting! It is indeed necessary for you to correct with the salt of wisdom this foolish people which is so devoted to the unsalted and stinking. All right, so here we are. Now that he says, for if he shall find worms, that is, sins, in them, because you have been negligent in your duty, he will command them as worthless to be thrown into the abyss of unclean things. And because you cannot restore to him his great loss, he will surely condemn you and drive you from his loving presence. But the equitable and pure, for how can the ignorant teach others? How can the licentious make others modest? And anyone has soiled his hand with baseness. How can he cleanse his impurities of another? We read also that if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into the ditch. So as you can see, the beginning part of his sermon is just really kind of a spiritual kind of a correction. It's showing, number one, is asserting papal authority, the fact that he is the Pope and he is invested by God. He is the supreme leader in the universe, the most important, after Christ, of Christ representative on earth. And he's coming as an admonisher, admonishing the Christians for ever falling into the depravity of sins. He's encouraging them to be on guard of their sins and encouraging them to be watchful over one another, calls them shepherds, and really begins to, thereafter, as you can see afterwards, he begins to really warn them that if they fail in this responsibility, then God doesn't have any need, for them. And so then what he says is this, let me just try and highlight the part. So as you can see, then he speaks about hell. So if people, less robbers, here we are. Okay. If anyone seizes or robs monks or clergymen or nuns or their servants or pilgrims or merchants, let him be anathematized, anathema, cursed. Now, that's very much in line with the peace of God movement. That's exactly what it was. It was about establishing peace, but the first people you have to protect and defend and support and not harm are going to be, of course, the papal authority or the clergy. And then he says, if any man who does not give a part of his goods as alms is punished with the damnation of hell, how should he be punished with punished who robs another of his goods? So for thus it happened to be to the rich man in the gospel. He was not punished because he had stolen the goods of another, but because he had not used well the things which were his. Okay, so all of this is just in line with papal, with the peace of God movement, and so that's the start. That's the start of his speech, and then he says. Yeah, so what I've just highlighted for you is just similar stuff. You're welcome to read the rest of it in your own time, but it's just similar things that he's speaking about. Okay, and then if we carry on, same stuff. Okay, now we're going to come to the main part in a second. Here we are. Now, as you can see over here, so he says, although, O sons of God, you have promised more firmly than ever to keep the peace among yourselves, that's the peace of God movement, and to preserve the rights of the church, there remains still, and by the way, the rights of the church, meaning the church not be, meddled with kind of temporal rulership or authority of a temporal ruler, emperor, over the matters of the church. I mean, the church has to be the main institute, has to be the main beacon of guidance in the world and beacon of correction, for all people in the world. He says, you must apply the strength of your righteousness to another matter, here we are, which concerns you as well as God. Now here we are, this is how it's coming now. For your brethren who live in the east, who are the brethren who live in the east? The brethren who live in the east are, of course, the Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Empire. This is Alexius Comnenus and his Christian empire. So although these are Orthodox Christians and there is a schism from decades before, the middle of the 11th century, he's appealing for kind of a Christian unity, that they're still your brothers in faith and you have a duty to them. And that's quite an interesting thing. So, urgent need of your help, and you must hasten to give them the aid which has often been promised them. So, for as the most of you have heard, the Turks and Arabs have attacked them and have conquered the territory of Romania, the Greek Empire. What's going to be very clear in their mind is the Battle of Manzikert 1074, because that was a devastating defeat for the Byzantines, as far west as the shore of the Mediterranean and the Hellespont, which is called the Arm of St. George. They've occupied more and more of the lands of those Christians and have overcome them in 7 battles. They have killed and captured many and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. Now notice, interesting in this letter, that Jerusalem does not take focal point. He doesn't begin by saying Jerusalem is under attack and the Holy Sepulchre is destroyed and we have to go there and recover, the sacred land of Jesus back for the Christians. He begins by the appeal of Alexius Comnenus, to the Pope against the Muslims. That's how he begins his letter. So it tells us quite a lot about the way that the narrative of Crusade, or the narrative of justification for the Crusade, was kind of a construct that was developed a lot over time. He then says, if you permit them to continue thus for a while with impunity, the faithful of God will be much more widely attacked by them. On this account, I, or rather the Lord, of course, because he is representative of the Lord, beseech you as Christ's herald to publish this everywhere and to persuade all people of whatever rank, foot soldiers and knights, poor and rich, to carry aid promptly to those Christians and to destroy that vile race, i.e. Arabs and Turks, Muslims, from the lands of our friends. I say this to those who are present. It meant also for those who are absent. Moreover, Christ commands it. Now, by the way, when this Council of Clermont was called, and all of these very high-ranking officials, clergy are present, in the council. Urban II, he, after delivering the speech, or the remainder of these speeches, he didn't leave it there, because he went on personal, propagation missions to very important places. He went, for example, to Toulouse. If you remember Toulouse, from last time we spoke about the Muslims coming to Al-Andalus, and it was As-Samh ibn Malik al-Khawlani who traveled to Toulouse with his army, and they fought against an army fighting under Duke Odo of Aquitaine. Duke Odo was not there. He went, then he came back, surprise attack, and Michael Hani was killed, in that place. But he traveled to Toulouse, right? That was kind of, he sent an army of Muslims to Toulouse. And so Urban II also went to Toulouse to call people, for the Crusade. He's traveling to Spain, traveling to France, traveling to Germany, right? So he's really making a thing out of it, and thousands of people are coming and hearing his message, right? Now, when it came to the participation in the Crusade, remember that out of the 60,000 who traveled, only 10% of them were in fact knights. Right? The other remaining 90% of the 60,000 were peasants, farmers, men, sorry, women, children. They were just like poor people, who just went there to get this remission of sins and appeal to the request by Pope Urban II. But Urban II is really making this whole appeal, a very, you could say, like a sophisticated, very well thought out, propaganda campaign led by him. He also went personally to other places, and one thing that he did is that he, in fact, chose the days of what's called feast days, and the feast days were the days where certain saints were celebrated, and it would really cause the amassing of large crowds of people in major churches who would come together, and celebrate the life and death of the priest. These were called feast days, and so where he traveled, one of the places he traveled for the feast day was in fact Tours. Right, so Tours, of course, we remember from the battle in 732 with Abdurrahman Ghafiqi against Charles Martellus. Now that's something that really was a big thing, I think, because if you imagine, Tours was the final place. The Muslims didn't go further than Tours, and although Muslims were still in Al-Andalus by that time, the fact that the Pope is in Tours was really kind of a reminder that this is where the great Battle of Tours took place. Charles Martel defeated the Muslims, and now we have the Pope, and he's calling for a crusade or a militia Christi against the Muslims of Al-Quds, of Jerusalem. And so this is what he's saying. And let's see what else he says. And so see how he ends it. So he says, all who die by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans, i.e., that's interesting. So we have now, this is the indulgence, because this is now the promise. And so remember, it wasn't just that you have remission of sins just by going there and coming back halfway because you got fed up. No remission of sins for you. It wasn't that you just go there and don't take part in the fighting. No remission of sins for you. It was very, very specific. All who die by the way, meaning if you die along the way because of like heat, exhaustion, starvation, whether by land or by sea, or you die in the battle. So those of you who can get to Jerusalem and they die in the battle against the pagans of course are called, the Muslims are called pagans in this case. And this is really the othering, the propaganda, the dehumanization of the Muslims. And remember, the Christians didn't know anything about Islam. Islam didn't exist in England at that time. They would have, of course, known, sorry, not England, my mistake, France. This is not happening in England, this is happening in France, in Clermont, right? They would have known, of course, about Islam from their involvement with the Spanish and also in France, but to call them pagans was really a deep insult. Shall have immediate remission of sins. And so here we have the indulgence, right? Let me read it again. All who die by the way, whether by land or the sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. There we are, investiture. He is invested. Oh, what a disgrace if such a despised and base race, as in the Arabs and the Turks, which worships demons. You see how how the language is quoted in this kind of real lack of knowledge of Islam, but just to otherize the Muslims, to make the journey kind of one that's motivated by a sense of cleansing the earth of these people who worship demons. And this is really what dehumanization is. It's to depict the other as so savage, like that it's that his removal is only for the salvation of planet Earth. And so this is a terrible thing. By the way, alhamdulillah, there is a book I've just written, will be published inshallah end of this month inshallah by iEra, and the book inshallah will be discussing a lot of this. It's about othering and dehumanization, so just look out inshallah. for that book, inshallah. So which worships demons should conquer a people which has the faith of omnipotent God and is made glorious with the name of Christ. With what reproaches will the Lord overwhelm us if we do not aid those who, with us, profess the Christian religion? Let those who have been accustomed unjustly to wage war. Now this part over here, I'm gonna highlight for you. Let those who have, here we are. Let those who have been accustomed unjustly to wage private warfare against the faithful now go against the infidels and end with victory this war which should have been begun a long time. So what he's saying is that he's appealing to not just the knightly class, he's appealing to thieves and brigands and murderers, criminals, right? Because they're the ones who are looking for forgiveness. And so he's saying, you guys have been fighting against each other, spilling each other's blood, stealing from one another, doing terrible crimes against each other. Just direct your efforts now away from each other and focus it towards this enemy of demon worshippers. And this is the Arabs and the Muslims, right? So let those who for a long time have been robbers now become knights. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Here we are, barbarians, the language of othering. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward. Let those who have been wearing themselves out in both body and soul now work for a double honor. Behold, on this side will be the sorrowful and the poor, on that the rich, on this side enemies of the Lord, on that the friends. Let those who go not out of the journey, but rent their lands and collect money. These are practicalities, because people, of course, have to think about what they can do with their lands and their money for their expenses. And as soon as winter is over, right? So whole idea is it's going to be a few years of preparation, a year of preparation before they set out. As soon as winter is over and spring comes, let them eagerly set out on the way with God as their guide. Okay, so very interesting. This was the account of Fulcher of Charts. And so what makes it so interesting is that this account that has no mention of of Jerusalem, right? There's no mention of Jerusalem or a Holy Sepulchre or fighting for the sacred city in this account. This account is just devoid. It doesn't have any of those things in it. There are, of course, mentions in other speeches of urban. So we're going to go through, inshallah, next week. But it didn't come through in the account of Fulcher of Chartres, and it just shows, therefore, that the idea behind the crusade was one that was developmental. These accounts came later, published later, and so with the reconquest with the capture of Jerusalem, looking back in hindsight, the Christian chroniclers, clergy, were seeking to validate the entire expedition by harking back to things that were familiar to them in terms of biblical imagery from the Old Testament. It didn't come across, of course, in the account of Fulcher of Chartres, but it will come across in other ones that we will look at closely. And so, therefore, I do want to end it here. I apologize again for the delay because I was getting used to the way that the OBS system works and how to connect things on YouTube. I'm happy that we got a chance to, alhamdulillah, get it going. And so I want us to take, therefore, the lesson that this is where we are. We're still on the preaching of the First Crusade. So we're doing the preaching now, then we will discuss after that the preparation and then the set out towards Jerusalem via Constantinople. And as you can see over here, this is I'll just show you the map very quickly so you can see what's happening over here. I'll just make it a bit big. Let's see how we can do this. So here we are. All right. So this is the map. You can get it. You can see over here. There's two routes being taken. One through kind of the through Albania, Bosnia, and the other one through Italy. But the whole idea was for them to meet up in Constantinople, as you can see on the map. We're going to discuss, inshallah, next week the kind of the renegades as well who set out towards Jerusalem. People like Peter the Hermit who took a lot of people with him. In fact, even some knights with him. But they did terrible things on the way in places like in Mainz, in France, and others like him, like Folkmar. These people, they attacked Jews, they killed Jews, and they began to propagate this idea that why would we want to travel all the way from where we are in Europe to Jerusalem to fight against that enemy when we have an enemy so close to us, i.e. the Jews, because they are the killers of Christ. And so this whole idea of killers of Christ became popular amongst those people, but they did terrible things, to the Jewish people, in those areas at that time. But they were not they were not the main bulk of the Crusader army. Saying that, however, Peter the Hermit did in fact get to Jerusalem. In fact, even gave a sermon on the Mount of Olives, looking towards Jerusalem before they invaded, that city. And so, but a lot of his followers, in fact, were killed by the Muslims as they just crossed past Constantinople. But we'll discuss, inshallah, that in more detail and see how they got to, from France, how they could get to all the way to Constantinople, and what's happening along the way. A very big siege, very, very big siege of Antioch. We're going to discuss that as well, inshallah. And then passing by Nicaea, Dorylaeum. These were taken quite quickly by the Crusaders. And then, as you can see on the map, on the east of Antioch, you can see the state of Edessa, in present-day Turkey. And this became a Christian state, for about 45 odd years, until it was retaken by Imad ad-Din Zengi, 1144, I think it was, or 46. Very, very important. In fact, the capture of Edessa is going to become a big part for us, inshallah, much later on, because it was a great spark in the Muslim jihad movement, jihad effort against the Crusaders. But actually, I just thought I'd show you the map because it's been at the top of the screen for all that time, and so here we have a chance to see it. In red, you can see the main routes followed by the First Crusade. But it makes sense, of course, for us to look at this in a better way, inshallah ta'ala, next week. And so again, may Allah reward all of you who did take the time to attend. Apologies again for the delay, because I just wanted to do it like this, so at least we could see the visuals, and at least we could read and appreciate the one of the accounts of Urban II together. And so again, Jazakumullah khairan. I tried to see, I don't know if there are any questions. You're welcome to ask questions, by the way. Hamza, Ahmed, Jazakallah khairan also to you for your time, for attending and for listening. And so I hope, inshallah, you're gonna carry on, inshallah, with us. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them, for a few minutes, if you have them. So I'll just stick around for a few minutes, inshallah, to see if you can. Oh, by the way, if you can also please like and subscribe to the page. I've never really had a YouTube page, but I think, alhamdulillah, I can start getting it going with videos like these. And so if you can please like and subscribe to the page, that would be much appreciated, inshallah, before you guys leave. Jazakumullah khairan. So let's end it there, inshallah. Allah bless you guys also again, for your time, and I hope inshallah to see you inshallah ta'ala next week. Question, Salam Doc, so it wasn't Peter the Hermit but really Pope Urban? No. So Pope Urban II never went on the crusade. In fact, he didn't even live to see, he didn't even live to hear the fact that Jerusalem has been taken by the Crusaders. He was the Pope who was pronouncing the crusade in 1095. He was the Pope, and the Pope didn't go on the crusade. But um, how do I do that? What does that say? Turn on notifications. How do I do that, brother? But yeah, sort of back to the question then. And so it wasn't, so the Peter the Hermit was just he was like a monk. He was a monk. I think he belonged to the I forgot, it wasn't the Cluniac monastic order, it was another monastic order, but he was a monk, but he was kind of seen as more of a rabble rouser, So what he did is he kind of massed this kind of group of a lot of poor people and villagers, and they went on the way to the crusade. Modern research suggests he also had some very important knights with him. And so what happened is that when they get to Constantinople, by the way, Alexius Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, was supposed to go on the crusade as well to Jerusalem, but he changed his mind because of what he saw of Peter the Hermit and his group of people. And he was just put off by the whole thing because he thought that maybe Peter the Hermit's people might end up attacking Constantinople, because along the way they're attacking, Jews, and so he felt threatened because of the fact that the Orthodox are not exactly the same as the Catholics, and so he. But then again, we're saying this, and it's true. He did go back. Then Peter the Hermit went back, but on his way back, he had an incident, and I think either he was taken by somebody back to the Christian camp, or he had a change of heart and mind and went back to the Christian camp. And when he did go back to Christian camp, he was accepted, and then fought with the Crusaders against the Muslims in Spain, in Jerusalem. And as I mentioned, he even gave a sermon, on the Mount of Olives, what we call Jabal Zaytun, and then he entered Jerusalem. What happened to him afterwards? He became what's called an almonizer. An almonizer was somebody who would give, I think it's called almonizer, somebody who gave alms. Like he became in charge of giving, food and clothing and these kind of things to poor people. And so that was Peter the Hermit, but that's not the Pope. Pope Urban II is the Pope himself, And Pope Urban II, remember, was famous not only for the crusade but also for the Curia. We mentioned that, I think, last week, about the fact that he set up the Curia, which was like this administrative center for the Catholic Church, and it exists until today. So the Roman Curia is Pope Urban II's real invention. Okay, question. Assalamu alaikum. Is the Temple of Jupiter the same as Masjid Umayyad in Syria? Jazakallah khair. Well, the Christians had, the pagans had many temples. I don't think the Umayyad Mosque, because Umayyad Mosque was a church before it became a mosque, right? But some days say that the Church of Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was either the temple of Jupiter or the temple of Venus. I think it was Venus or it was Jupiter. These were pagan temples. Remember, of course, that when Christianity, this is 313, so Christianity was, Constantine has this vision. Constantine is Helena's son. So Helena is Constantine the First's mother, and he has this vision where he believed that, where he believed Jesus came to him and said to him in his vision that if you fight against his rival in the east called Maxentius, the fight is on the Milvian Bridge. If he fights with the sign of the Christian symbol on his shield and on his soldiers' shields, he would be victorious. And then he was victorious, and then he became Christian, and then he had the Edict of Tolerance or Toleration, and then he made Christianity the state religion, right? Then you had the Council of Nicaea and so on and so forth. However, I don't think there are that many historians who would suggest that Constantine had a really sincere conversion to Christianity. Why? Because he was still furnishing the pagan temples, right, of of Rome, of Constantinople. The center, the seat of power moves from Rome to Constantinople in Constantine's time, right? So, but he's still furnishing the pagan temples as this alleged Christian. But maybe, I mean, who knows? The other funny thing is, I mean, it's not funny, but it's an interesting thing, I think, is the fact that in the Council of Nicaea, you had the Arian, you had Arius. Arius was this priest, and he contended the Trinity. He was the kind of the rival against the Trinitarian Athanasius. So Athanasius wrote this book called on the Trinity, and he's promoting the Trinity as the belief. Constantine calls all these bishops around the empire and makes them sit together in the Council of Nicaea, and Arius was there. So Arius is contending, and he's saying, no, Jesus is less than the Father. Jesus is subordinated to the Father. Jesus is dependent on the Father, and is more like a creation. And so now, of course, the faith that won the day in Nicaea was the Trinitarian faith, right? And so then Arius is exiled somewhere. But it's interesting, because when Constantine the emperor died, he was baptized, and so there are two baptisms: baptism at birth and baptism at death. The death baptism was just to be sure that the person is going to go to heaven, because he has to have just in case baptism when he dies. And so the idea was that, and so when he died, he was baptized by an Arian, right? So by a follower of Arius. And so that's interesting, because if he really favored Trinitarianism, then perhaps he should be baptized by a Trinitarian, but he's baptized by an Arian. The next emperor, Constantine's son, Constantius I, himself was an Arian, right? And so, and I think the one after him became an apostate, Julian the Apostate, and it goes back to, so it's going back and forth, depending who the ruler is. That's going to have a bigger significance on who what the people are going to end up believing. And so Allah knows best at the end of the day. I mean, all right, so if there are any other questions. But then again, I don't know, it may have been that the Christian church was built on the temple, or a temple of Jupiter. I'm not sure. I just know, of course, the masjid was on a church, and it allegedly contains the remains of Yahya alayhi salam, of John the Baptist. And this is why in 2001 the Pope, the other Pope, I forgot I forgot his name now, but the previous, must be 2 popes before, went to visit. I was in Damascus, in fact, in the time when the Pope came to visit, and he visited the Umayyad Mosque, prayed at the alleged location where the remains of Yahya alayhi salam, John the Baptist, are. Okay, so Sarah question: could we say that the partial destruction of Replica served in giving a religious justification? No, it definitely did. It is undoubtedly true that it gave a religious justification for the Christians to want to rescue the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The only contention, of course, would be the fact that it happened so long ago, because that's 1009 and this is 1095, right? And so, and there had to be, of course, and there were pilgrims who were still traveling, after those decades, to Jerusalem. There could be other things, like, for example, there are reports that there were reports that they have that Muslims attacked Christian caravans and plundered their caravans and abused them. All of these kind of negative stories are filtering through back into Europe, and they're hearing this. But it seems that the reason for the crusade was bigger than we actually think. I think it had a lot to do with the reaffirming of papal control and authority over and above temporal rulers, over and above the Orthodox Church. It was a way of really nailing it. Because remember, what's just happened before? Urban II, 1183, was imprisoned by Henry IV because he's a supporter of Pope Gregory the Eighth, right? You're having all of these things. You have the In Domine Nomini. You know, you have all of these things happening where the Pope is challenged to justify the authority of the papacy and the clergy over and above temporal rulers. And so for the Pope to authorize a crusade and then to say, no one else, no kind of temporal ruler involvement in this, because this is the church saying this. I think it was a way really of promoting the strength of the papacy in this time, also perhaps to heal the rift between the papacy and the Greek Orthodox, and also to show supremacy of Catholicism over the Orthodox Church, and also, of course, to to appeal to the request of Alexius Comnene. This is why the Crusaders, as you can see from the map, they could look at the map again. They traveled. Here we are. They're traveling to Constantinople first before they're traveling to Jerusalem, and the whole idea was for them to meet in the spring there in Constantinople and then head together from there to Jerusalem. By the way, the question before about Peter the Hermit, when they get there first, they arrive in Constantinople first before the main crusading armies of Stephen of Blois and other major crusading families and nobles get to Constantinople. And so because they get there early, they wanted to make a rush into Asia Minor, and it was a big blunder, because when they went there, the Muslims were prepared for them, and they defeated all of them. But he himself, Peter the Hermit, was saved, and so that's what happened. And so yeah, and so you say to the call of unification amongst the two churches, yeah. No, I don't think the Orthodox Church made a case of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre being destroyed, and perhaps it was, I just think because there's too many decades had passed, since that time, it doesn't seem right, in your mind that this is going to be the main reason, for the crusade. At the end of the day, if you look at Pope Urban II's propaganda, it's about, the vilification of Muslims, the projecting them as the other, as dehumanized entity, as defilers. And you'll see, in the other accounts that we're going to go through, inshallah, next week, how they say things like Muslims slaughter their children, at the altar. Muslims, do terrible things. Muslims worship an idol called Muhammad. So these are crazy things that Pope Urban II was speaking, or alleged of speaking about in his speeches. And so I think all of these put together seem to suggest that people were roused by this. But then again, we should say we don't know exactly what the individual motivations for every single person was. Maybe some people only went there because they needed forgiveness, because there were murderers and thieves and bad people. Maybe some people went there because they wanted to go and plunder wealth. Maybe they were poor, they needed the money. Maybe some people went there because they needed to settle. They wanted to settle in the kingdom of Jerusalem, and so this is what they did, And so people had other, different motivations for the things that they did in that time. Question: are there any books you'd recommend? I find that a majority of the books give a Christian view other than the Chronicles of Ibn al-Arabi. I don't know if Chronicles of Arabi speak about the Crusades. No, I mean, from the Muslim perspective, the earliest accounts you're gonna have is like you have the book by Ibn al-Qalanisi. This was like a book on the history of spoke a lot about Damascus. Ibn al-Qalanisi was quite early, but the earliest account, we're going to go through all of this. Earliest account was by the faqih of a Shafi'i faqih called Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami. So my book, if you can access my book I think is one of, well, I think it's very good. It's called The Cutting Edge of the Poet's Sword, Muslim Poetic Responses to the Crusades. And it really has a lot on the Muslim response, the counter crusade, the Muslims fight back against the Crusader, not just from a political perspective, but from a literary perspective. Who were the main key poets? Who were the authors? Who were the scholars? What kind of sermons did they deliver, and to what end as well? And so that's very important. Other books you might find interesting are like the Travels of Ibn Jubair, the Rihla of Ibn Jubair, a very interesting account. He's on his way to make the Hajj, in fact, from Al-Andalus, and he kind of meets the entourage around Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. But this is later, 1180s. But the earliest accounts are 3 or 4, and we're going to go through all of them, inshallah, in a few weeks' time when we get there. And that is the text of As-Sulami, called Kitab al-Jihad, the Book of Jihad. That's 1105, he dies. A poem by Al-Abi Waradi, Muzaffar ad-Din al-Abi Waradi. That's a poet that I've translated his poetry in my book. Ibn al-Khayyat, very early. That's one of the earliest accounts. I've translated his poem also in my book. And an anonymous poet that finds its way in the 16th century voluminous collection by Ibn Taghribirdi called Nujum al-Zahira. And so these kind of 4 or 5 accounts were the earliest accounts of the Muslim response to the Crusades in Al-Andalus, in Bayt al-Maqdis in Jerusalem. But inshallah we can talk more about that inshallah next time. All right, so I think inshallah should we call it a day inshallah for here. So may Allah bless all of you again inshallah for your questions and for your attendance and for your listening, and I hope inshallah we've learned something today. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.